Well, I'm going to try a couple of different ways of sorting this brass. Now, this brass is all federal champion brass, but it's a little bit different. Even though it's all federal champion, some of it is from federal champion 556 and some of it is from the 223, and they have a slightly different head stamp. So I'm going to begin this sorting by head stamp and separate or subset this different federal champion brass. So for instance, this here is 556 brass. It's a federal champion from 2014. So all these I'm putting here. This, on the other hand, is federal champion 223. And this 223 brass I'm going to leave here. So the 556 brass goes over here. The 223 stuff goes over here. Okay, that's actually pretty interesting. There is almost the exact same number of federal 556 brass with either the 2014, some of them were 2015 head stamp. So I'm going to set these aside for a while. And now I'm going to further subset this federal champion 223 brass having an identical head stamp. And I'm going to try to get enough rounds subset out of this in a couple of different ways. One of the things that I want to try is looking at the case head diameter. This is the case head, and what I noticed is one of the things that I always do as part of my case preparation is to measure the case head diameter. I call it my case head expansion test. And the maximum size, according to SAMI, that's SAAMI, for a 223 or 556, a maximum size of the case head diameter is 375. I remember that because it relates back to the 375 H&H Mag, kind of a famous big game cartridge. And I measure this, and as I was preparing this group of federal brass, I noticed that some of this brass is at 0.372, 373, even all the way down to 0.371. So it sort of makes sense that the brass that has a 0.371 diameter, assuming that that brass has a relatively or has a similar thickness of the brass, well, then it makes sense that this burning chamber, as I call it, inside the case itself would be slightly smaller for a 0.371 diameter case relative to a 0.373. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to resort these things, or subset this federal 223 brass by case head diameter. This one in particular here is one of those 371s. I'm going to continue this process and see if I can get these further subset. Well, I now have a group of brass that has a case head diameter of 0.371 and another group of 0.373. And all this stuff will be loaded identically with the same primers, same powder charge, and the same bullets. I'm going to be using the 69 grain Barnes match burners in all of these tests. Now, another thing that I've been wondering about is I was using this Lyman case length gauge. This is the EZ case length gauge. I noticed that some of this brass, of course all of it, fits to the maximum, but I noticed that some of it is actually just a little bit short. I mean, it's visibly short. I can see a little bit of light between the gauge and the top of the case itself. So I'm going to see if I can sort this brass with that brass that is perfect, kind of tight in here. I can feel this scraping right here, versus those that's a little bit, shows that little bit of light. So this one I'm going to call a perfect fit. I can't move it up and down. This one's the same way. And we'll find some here, like this one here. See that? How its total length is actually a little bit less than the maximum. So I'm going to place those right here, hoping to get 5 rounds of each. It may be hard to get 5 rounds of the short ones. Well, there's a second right there. Well, now I've got 2 more sets of brass. One I'll call long brass, where its overall length is equal to essentially the maximum of our 223 brass. And the other I'm calling our short brass, where all the pieces were at 1.750 of an inch, or just slightly less than that. I didn't have enough quite at 1.750. So they're about 1/100 of an inch shorter than those maximum allowance under SAMI. So we're going to load those things up and see how case length affects accuracy and the consistency of this brass as we fire it over the chronograph. Now this one I'm excited about. This is another test I want to do as a surrogate for case neck, well, as a surrogate for the thickness of the brass that's being used in these cases. So this is the Sinclair case neck sorting tool. This is the main body of the unit right here, and its support rod right here. Now you can purchase a bunch of different pilets. This is a 224 or 22 caliber pilot. And what you'll do is you'll insert the case onto this support rod. The neck will sit right about here, the mouth right there, and this point right here will protrude through the flash hole. Now of course you need an indicator gauge, and I'm using my Hornady indicator gauge that I took off of case concentricity gauge. It works just fine. It works perfectly for this. Now this brass over here that I'm going to be testing is Federal Champion 556 brass with the Federal Champion 14, and some of them are Federal Champion 15, 2014, 2015 brass. So I'm going to make sure that I'm testing 2014 versus 2014. I just want to make that real clear. You need to make sure on these 556s, sometimes that flash hole is not really centered in the case, in which case this will not work. But you know, in most instances it'll work just fine. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate it. Kind of make a note. There's a little mark on the neck right there. I'll kind of keep an eye on that one. I'm going to rotate that around. And I'm going to watch the dial for the point at which it reads the lowest. And that point appears to be right about there. Did you notice that? So this is 12 and a half thousandths of an inch, which is, you know, pretty common. 12 to 13, 14 thousandths of an inch. So now what I'm going to do to make this easy is I'm going to rotate this dial. And I'm now setting the low point to be 0. And as I rotate this around again, notice it doesn't drop below 0, so that means I set it about right. We just got above 5 thousandths. Looks about the high point. Now I want to make sure that you're seated correctly on the spindle so that you don't move this case this way or that way, which will really throw your readings. Looks like we're at about 6 thousandths. You know, so this is really, number one, it's thick in parts of this case neck. In other parts, it's not. So it is actually very inconsistent to plus or minus 6 thousandths of an inch. Let's take a look at another. There we go. We want this to be reading midway on this neck area. We don't want it reading up on the shoulder. That's going to really throw us off. And I also don't like to have it read right on the mouth itself. So we'll repeat this process, watching the dial for the low point. Looks like that's about it. Once again, we'll rotate this to that low point, and now we'll watch it for the reading. 5 thousandths, almost 6 again. Yeah. So it's very similar to the other piece of brass we just looked at. What I'm doing is I'm sorting the brass. I'm going to try to find some that's, number one, very uniform within about 1,000th or so of all the other brass. Trying to get about 5 cases of that for this test. And then we'll choose some that are, more inconsistent like this. Let's go to 3 thousandths of an inch variability or more. Well, that's done. We now have 2 subsets of varying case neck thicknesses, and I'm thinking that may be an indicator or a surrogate of overall case thickness. So we have some that varied by only 1/1000th of an inch in case neck thickness. That's pretty consistent stuff. No neck turning involved here, so that's good stuff. And then we have another set that varied by 3 or more thousandths of an inch. So that's good. This would be a nice experiment as well. Time to head out to the range once again, and this time I'm going to use my IWI Tavor. Now for my baseline factory ammo, I'm using PMC X-Tac ammo. And for the back to the brass rounds that we're using, here's our different subsets. We have 2 subsets of Federal Champion brass that have been sorted by their head diameter, their case head diameter. We have 5 rounds that I'll be firing where the case head diameter was 0.371 and 5 other cases where the case head diameter was 0.373 or larger. We have 2 subsets based on overall length of the cases. 5 of those cases match the SAMI specs just perfectly, and the other 5 are short by a couple thousandths of an inch. We also have 2 subsets prepared based on case neck thickness. And these are where case neck thickness varied by only 1/1000th of an inch or less, and those that varied 3 thousandths of an inch or more. Now I've also loaded 2 subsets, 5 rounds each, of just random brass. I've grabbed everything from Federal to Lake City to Winchester, etc., etc. I've loaded 5 of those, and I've loaded a second 5. Again, no difference in those, but I'm going to be shooting 2 different groups of 5. In all cases, my reloads are using Varget powder from Hodgdon, 24.3 grains, measured precisely. I'm using the Federal AR Match primers, and it's all topped off with Barnes Match Burners 69 grain bullets. Well, enough talk. Let's head out to the range and see how these things do, shooting for group and over the chronograph. The first 5-shot group is with this PMC X-Tac factory ammo. These are 62 grain bullets, and we're getting an average of almost 2,900 feet per second out of this, but a rather large standard deviation of 43 feet per second. One thing I noticed about PMC is that it's really dirty. It seems to be really dirty, and it requires quite a bit of cleaning afterwards, especially if you're firing quite a few rounds of the PMC factory ammo. Now the second group is what I'm calling my assorted or unsorted brass. Now this again is loaded with 69 grain Barnes match burners, and in this case, this 5-shot group, we're getting 2,600 feet per second average muzzle velocity, and kind of a high standard deviation again of 35 feet per second. The extreme spread of this group isn't too bad, 1.5 inches, but this is 50 yards. And so, well, I always expect a whole lot better, having done a lot of work with precision rifles. Now, the next two 5-shot groups are from the cases that were sorted by their case head diameter. The very first group has a small case head diameter of 0.371 inches. The second 5-shot group that we're going to be firing has a larger case head diameter of 0.373 all the way to 0.374 of an inch. And now SAMI specs, by the way, indicate that these cases should not exceed 0.375 of an inch. Now this is very interesting results. The small case head diameter has a muzzle velocity of 2,600, roughly 2,600 feet per second, and a standard deviation of 20 feet per second. Now that's getting a little bit more reasonable, but still it's about a 2-inch extreme spread on that 5-shot group. The second 5-shot group, where the case head diameter was larger, has a very small, very, very nice standard deviation of only 6 feet per second. Now that could be because that case is fitting the chamber a whole lot better and making the shots much more uniform, one to the next to the next. And again, we're having an extreme spread of that 5-shot group of about 2 inches. Nothing to write home about there. The next two groups are using cases that have been sorted by their overall length. The first 5-shot group is being fired with what I'm calling short cases. Well, they're not really terribly short. They are 1/100th of an inch shorter than the long cases. So that is that the short cases are 1.75 inches, or some of them were actually a little bit less than that. And the long cases were full length 1.76. Now I say full length, again that's in respect to the SAMI specs for this cartridge. The next two groups that I'm firing these cases have been sorted by neck uniformity. The first 5-shot group is where the necks were very ununiform. They varied by 3 thousandths of an inch or more, and we actually had a couple cases in there that varied by 5 or 6 thousandths of an inch. We're getting standard deviations of these of 19 feet per second and an extreme spread of 1.4 inches. The much more uniform case necks that varied by only 1/1000th of an inch. Now these were not turned case necks; these were factory and just simply measured and sorted this way. Really didn't improve things though, did it? 20 feet per second standard deviation, essentially the same, and a 1.5 inch extreme spread on that 5-shot group. Now we might think that, okay, we got this stuff figured out. It's starting to give me some trends, showing me that this type of sorting might be a little bit better than that type of sorting. So then what I did is I wanted to fire the final 5-shot group, which is the second of that random bunch of cases, the assorted cases, the unsorted cases. So I fired this, another 5-shot groups, and this is the monkey wrench that's in the works right now. We're getting muzzle velocities averaging, again, 2,600 feet per second. Standard deviation has plummeted from the first assorted grouping of 35 feet per second. Now it's plummeted down to 8 feet per second. And with an extreme spread that's really quite good. In fact, this is the best group that I shot all day. Just barely over 1 inch of a 5-shot group at 50 yards. So what does this all tell us? Number one, it tells me that there seems to be an effect of barrel heating when I'm firing all these different groups. And if we look at the standard deviation of those muzzle velocities over time, what we see is a kind of a uniform trend of standard deviations dropping from the first group that I fired, that PMC factory ammo, all the way to the 9th group that I fired, which was that last unsorted or assorted cases. The R squared that you're seeing there is 0.45, which means that 45% of the variability in standard deviation can be explained simply by that shot order, the group order, and well, it's not just because it was shot in a certain order. What it is, I'm sure, is that the barrel is heating, the barrel is fouling a little bit, all those sort of things. And it's not necessarily how things were loaded, or the selection of bullets, the selection of powders, anything like that. Because for 8 of those 9 groups, that did not vary. The powder charge, the primer, the bullet was identical. We can look at this again, looking at extreme spread over time, and we see an even stronger correlation. R squared is now 51 or 51%. You know what we'd like to see? We'd like to see a nice trend in standard deviation versus extreme spread. So on this graph, I'm looking at standard deviation along the x-axis and extreme spread along the y-axis. So that is suggesting that standard deviation, or highly uniform ammunition, should drive a tight group. I think that makes sense logically. But we're not seeing a strong R squared there. it's only 0.16, or essentially 16%. So standard deviation really is not explaining the extreme spreads or the group sizes that we're getting. What we'd like to see is some of those points appearing in the lower left corner of that graph. That group or couple of groups has very low standard deviation of muzzle velocities and a very small extreme spread. The only one that kind of carried through as I expected it would was the PMC factory ammo, which is the kind of the opposite. High standard deviation, high extreme spread. This is kind of that blasting ammo, kind of fun stuff to shoot. And so it's appearing in the upper right corner of this graph. The best groups that we see are, first of all, the assorted brass. But one of those groups appears sort of near the left side or lower left side of this graph, but the other one's all the way on the other side. What's that really telling us? It's just showing us that if we're just going to use an assortment of brass, grab some brass and load the stuff up, we might get lucky in some cases and have some really nice results. In other cases, far from excellent results. It's just pure randomness. We saw a chance happening of some very nice groups, low standard deviation. Can we count on it? Heck no, because the other one was 35 feet per second and in a much larger group. So we don't want to say, yeah, just grab some brass and start loading up. No, this experiment does not validate that. Let's look at some of these others, and I'm kind of interested in this sorted by length. The sorted by length has those red dots on it, and what we're seeing is that both of those are on the left half of this graph, and they are about 1 inch extreme spread. It's a little bit larger than that in one case, so that's not too bad. So what we're seeing here is, once again, it still does pay dividends to sort our brass, at least by head stamp. Sorting by head diameter really didn't work out very well as far as producing nice small groups goes, but it did give us some pretty good, pretty low standard deviations of those muzzle velocities. And standard deviation is really important, especially as we start shooting at a little bit longer ranges. Was one sorting method by far better than another? No, we really didn't see that either. Perhaps a composite, if a person had an awful lot of brass, maybe you had an awful lot of federal brass or an awful lot of Lake City brass, which I do, a person could perhaps sort by, number one, the head stamp, Lake City of a certain year, and then by head diameter, and by case length, and by case neck, and might end up getting some very uniform brass, and plenty of that uniform brass to be doing some pretty good shooting with these AR-type rifles. Well, there we have it. Kind of a cool test. I really am interested in this barrel warming type of phenomenon that we're seeing, and how it was affecting our standard deviations and our group sizes. That is really interesting to me. Leave your comments in the section below. Interested to see what you think about all this sort of stuff. And thanks for watching.